The moment federal agents began carrying items out of that house, everything about this investigation changed. Not the house where Nancy Guthrie had lived for years. Not the Catalina Foothills property where blood was found near the entrance and a doorbell camera had been torn from the wall. A different house entirely. A house connected to someone investigators had been quietly circling for weeks. And when national reporters, including Brian Entin of News Nation, began documenting that activity on camera, the emotional direction of this case shifted in a way it would never recover from, because suddenly this no longer looked like the work of a stranger. It looked like investigators were reconstructing something deliberate, something that required access, familiarity, planning, and intimate knowledge of one elderly woman's most private vulnerabilities. And once that possibility entered the conversation, this case stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like pressure, building slowly toward something much darker. Tonight, we are going to walk through everything carefully. The timeline, the evidence, the behavioral patterns, the digital records. And the moment Brian Entin stood outside that connected property and documented what federal agents were doing inside. Because when every piece of this case is placed beside the next, the picture that emerges is deeply disturbing. And if you are watching this for the first time, make sure you stay until the end, because the details surrounding the final hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared are unlike anything this case has publicly produced so far. Before we go any further, if you have not already subscribed to Keith's Crime Files, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. And if this kind of deep investigative breakdown is what you come here for, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about cases like Nancy Guthrie's. Now let us get into it. The evening before Nancy Guthrie vanished, she spent time with family. Dinner, conversation, the kind of ordinary gathering that defines normal life for millions of families across the country. Nothing publicly reported about that evening suggested tension. Nothing visible indicated that the night would end in catastrophe. By every external account available, it was a routine family gathering, the kind that leaves no mark because nothing about it appears worth remembering. But investigators would spend weeks examining every minute of that evening in forensic detail, because what happened after that gathering ended became the most consequential and most disputed portion of the entire case. At some point following the evening with family, Nancy Guthrie returned to her Catalina Foothills home, and somewhere between that return and the following morning, she vanished. The next day, her seat at church was empty. For a woman whose faith was central to her identity, that absence was immediately alarming to those who knew her. When concerned individuals attempted to contact her and received no response, someone went to the residence. What they found there transformed what might have been a welfare check into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in recent Arizona history. Blood was discovered near the entrance of the home. The doorbell camera had been physically removed from the wall. Nancy Guthrie was nowhere inside the property, and she has not been seen publicly since. The initial public narrative around the disappearance was built around a specific emotional frame, and it was one that the physical evidence at the surface level appeared to support. A violent home invasion, a nighttime abduction, a vulnerable elderly woman taken from an expensive neighborhood by an unknown intruder who emerged from the darkness and disappeared back into it. That frame made psychological sense to the public for understandable reasons. Blood near the door, a missing camera, a woman who lived alone without overnight support, an unexplained gap of hours before anyone realized something was wrong. Every visible element of the scene pointed toward the kind of crime people imagine when they hear the phrase home invasion. But investigators were not operating on imagination. They were operating on evidence. And almost immediately, something about the physical scene began disturbing the professionals who examined it. The scene did not feel chaotic. That observation may sound subtle, but for experienced criminal investigators, the absence of chaos at a violent crime scene is not a neutral detail. It is a significant one. Random offenders, the kind of strangers who target homes impulsively or opportunistically, almost always leave evidence of their own internal disorder behind. Broken sequences, unnecessary damage, sloppy exits, items disturbed without obvious purpose, improvised decisions visible in the physical record. None of that characterized the scene at Nancy Guthrie's residence in the way investigators would expect from an impulsive intruder. Instead, the word that reportedly surfaced among analysts privately following the case was a word that fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Controlled. The timing appeared controlled. The movement appeared controlled. The operational window surrounding the disappearance appeared to reflect someone who understood the environment before the crime ever began, not someone encountering it for the first time under pressure. And once investigators shifted their focus from the physical scene itself toward the relationships and the people surrounding Nancy Guthrie's daily life, the case began moving in a very different direction very quickly. The detail that restructured the entire investigation emotionally was not a piece of physical evidence. It was a fact about timing and proximity. The last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive was not a stranger. It was her own son-in-law, Tommaso Sheen. That fact transformed the emotional architecture of the investigation almost immediately. Now, it is critically important to be precise here. Being the last known person in the company of a victim does not automatically implicate anyone in a crime. Families drive elderly relatives home regularly. Son-in-laws attend family dinners routinely. Ordinary life produces ordinary timelines that carry no criminal weight whatsoever. Investigators understand that completely, but investigators are specifically trained to examine sequence rather than isolated actions. And the sequence surrounding Nancy Guthrie's final confirmed hours became increasingly difficult to approach without serious questions. Tommaso Sheen had been present at the family gathering the evening before Nancy disappeared. He was reportedly involved in her return home that night. He had been inside her Catalina Foothills residence on multiple prior occasions. He was familiar with the property, familiar with the layout, and familiar with the routines of someone he had known through family connection for years. And once investigators began examining the timeline surrounding her return home that night, an evidentiary gap emerged that became one of the most intensely analyzed portions of the entire case. There was no rideshare record establishing an independent timestamp for her arrival. There was no third-party verification from someone with no connection to the family, confirming exactly what happened once she reached her front door. The details of what occurred during that final stretch of the evening rested almost entirely on recollection. And recollection, as every experienced detective understands, becomes unstable once it encounters sustained investigative pressure. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with exhaustive attention. What time did Nancy enter the residence? Who walked her to the door? How long did anyone remain at the property? Were interior lights visible to neighbors afterward? Did anyone in the surrounding area hear movement at the home during the late evening or early morning hours? The operational window surrounding the disappearance appeared unusually precise, and that precision became one of the most troubling elements of the entire case. Then a detail emerged that completely changed the evidentiary foundation of the investigation. The pacemaker. Nancy Guthrie's cardiac pacemaker was equipped with a remote monitoring system designed to transmit health data wirelessly. According to reports that entered public circulation as the investigation progressed, the final transmission associated with that monitoring system stopped during the early morning hours following the family dinner. That detail struck investigators with significant force, not because it answered every question, but because it answered one question with a reliability that human memory simply cannot provide. Technology does not misremember. It does not reconstruct events under emotional pressure. It does not adjust its account based on investigative questioning. The pacemaker monitoring system recorded what it recorded, and what it recorded created an electronic timestamp that narrowed the operational window of the disappearance with a precision that transformed the entire evidentiary picture. At some point during those early morning hours, Nancy Guthrie was either moved from the location where the monitoring device could transmit, or something happened that interrupted the system's function. Either possibility carried enormous investigative weight, because now investigators possessed something more durable than testimony. They possessed a technological anchor around which the entire timeline could be organized. And when detectives placed that electronic timestamp beside another deeply troubling reality, the sequence became far more serious. Silence. No meaningful overnight communication of any kind. No calls received or placed. No texts. No check-in of any description. No interruption to the quiet surrounding the property during the hours when everything was apparently going wrong. By itself, that silence proves nothing. Adults do not maintain constant contact with elderly relatives overnight. Ordinary life produces ordinary communication gaps that carry no sinister meaning. Investigators know that, but investigators also understand that context changes the meaning of silence entirely. The context here was specific and deeply significant. Investigators knew Nancy Guthrie was elderly and lived alone. They knew she removed her hearing aids before sleeping each night, which meant that once she was asleep, she would be largely unable to detect movement around the property. They knew she relied on medication. They knew there was no overnight caregiver present at the residence. And they knew that the home's security coverage had gaps that left portions of the property without reliable camera monitoring. Taken individually, each of those details sounds like the ordinary reality of an elderly woman living independently. Taken together, under the lens of an active criminal investigation, they created a profile of vulnerability that investigators found impossible to simply contextualize away. Because that combination of vulnerabilities, when viewed through the lens of what the crime scene had already told them, suggested something deeply uncomfortable. Whoever entered that home appeared to operate with confidence, not the frantic confidence of someone moving quickly through adrenaline. Deliberate confidence, the kind that comes from one of only two sources, experience or information. The surveillance footage that existed deepened those concerns considerably. Video reportedly captured a masked individual approaching the residence during the early morning hours. The disguise itself was not what drew the sharpest investigative attention. What investigators focused on was the movement. The individual moved purposefully. There was no visible hesitation near the entry points of the property. No wandering, no disorientation, no time lost orienting to an unfamiliar layout. The approach was efficient. The movement appeared comfortable. And comfort, in the language of criminal investigation, implies familiarity. Experienced investigators know that strangers encountering an unfamiliar property under pressure almost always betray that unfamiliarity through their movement. They slow down at unexpected points. They hesitate at corners. They lose time processing spatial information they did not possess before arriving. Even practiced criminals, when working a location they have not studied extensively, leave evidence of adjustment in how they move. The individual captured on the available footage did not appear to be adjusting to anything. The movement suggested the person already knew where they were going. Familiarity with a property can come from many sources: neighbors, service workers, previous visitors, repeated social contact over time. Investigators were careful not to collapse this observation into a single conclusion, but the operational implications were impossible to dismiss. Someone appeared to understand the physical environment of that property before entering it under criminal circumstances, and the more investigators examined the totality of the scene, the more another possibility pressed forward. Someone may have known not just the property, but the person living inside it with a level of intimate detail that went far beyond casual acquaintance. The residents of the Catalina Foothills home reportedly lacked several layers of protective infrastructure that investigators later considered significant to understanding what happened that night. No active overnight monitoring system of the kind that triggers automatic emergency responses. No caregiver or overnight companion. No reliable emergency alert device of the personal kind, commonly recommended for elderly individuals living alone. Inconsistent camera coverage that left portions of the exterior without reliable documentation. And the hearing aids, removed before sleep, which effectively severed Nancy Guthrie's primary channel for detecting any disturbance around the property once she was in bed. To ordinary observers, Those details sounded tragic. The natural vulnerabilities of aging, of independence, of living life on one's own terms without the constant presence of protective infrastructure. To investigators, those same details sounded like something else. They sounded exploitable. And if the person who entered that home already understood all of those vulnerabilities simultaneously, then the disappearance no longer carried the emotional signature of randomness. It carried the emotional signature of optimization, of someone who had identified every layer of protective absence and chosen a window accordingly. That possibility was one of the most disturbing conclusions investigators found themselves unable to avoid as the case progressed, because optimization requires information, and information of that specific and intimate nature does not come from studying a stranger. It comes from knowing someone, from being inside their world, from understanding their daily existence in a way that only repeated proximity and personal relationship provides. The disappearance, investigators increasingly believed, may not have been opportunistic at all. It may have been planned, and planned crimes involving elderly vulnerable victims carry a specific investigative implication that immediately redirects the entire analytical framework of a case. They point toward motive that preceded the event itself. Once planning entered the conversation, investigators began moving rapidly toward motive analysis, and that analysis brought something into focus that had existed quietly beneath the surface of the case from the beginning: financial pressure. Reports began circulating publicly that conversations involving money may have occurred in the period before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The precise nature of those conversations was never confirmed in complete detail through official charging documents during this phase of the investigation. Law enforcement maintained careful and restrained public language around the financial dimension of the case, but emotionally, the effect on public understanding was immediate and significant. The final family dinner, which had previously existed in the public imagination as a neutral and ordinary event, suddenly carried weight it had not carried before. Every interaction surrounding that last evening acquired a different quality. The goodbye, the drive home, the details of what was said and what was not said, the overnight silence that followed, all of it became heavier once financial pressure entered the interpretive frame. Experienced investigators and prosecutors understand something fundamental about crimes involving elderly victims. Financial motivation appears with striking frequency. Access to assets, concerns about inheritance structures, growing pressure from debt or financial strain, dependency dynamics that shift as family circumstances change. These elements surface repeatedly in cases where an elderly victim is targeted by someone within their own relational world. None of those dynamics automatically establish criminal conduct. None of them individually transform a person into a suspect. But they establish investigative direction, and investigative direction in a case this complex matters enormously because it determines where the analytic energy focuses and what evidence becomes most important to pursue. Investigators appeared increasingly focused on reconstructing the relationship dynamics surrounding Nancy Guthrie, rather than continuing to build theories around unknown intruders. That shift in focus was not accidental. It reflected what the accumulated evidence was already suggesting about the nature of this crime. The investigation entered a new phase the moment reporters stopped focusing exclusively on the crime scene at the Catalina Foothills home and began paying close attention to where federal agents were actually directing their energy. That distinction became critically important. Experienced journalists embedded in long-running criminal investigations understand something the general public often misses entirely. Law enforcement agencies reveal their investigative priorities through physical movement, which locations they return to repeatedly, which properties they formally secure, which vehicles they remove, and subject to intensive forensic examination, which homes they spend extended hours processing. The activity is the message, even when the words remain carefully restrained. When national reporters began documenting simultaneous investigative activity at multiple locations connected to the case, the emotional direction of the story shifted dramatically. This was no longer a broad geographic canvas of neighborhood canvassing. It looked targeted, specific, Deliberate one property drew an extraordinary level of attention. The home connected to Tommaso Sheen. Law enforcement never publicly announced formal charges during this period. That distinction remains important and should not be minimized. But investigators reportedly conducted extensive and sustained activity surrounding the property. The scale of that activity unsettled everyone observing the case closely. Items were removed from inside the residence. Evidence technicians spent extended and documented periods working inside the property. Vehicles connected to the address reportedly underwent intensive forensic examination, and perhaps most significantly, investigators appeared to approach the location with specific objectives already established before they arrived. Not the broad sweep of an exploratory search looking for anything useful, the focused efficiency of targeted evidence recovery. There is a fundamental difference between those two things, and anyone familiar with how criminal investigations operate understands that difference immediately. Exploratory searches are wide. They cover ground. Targeted searches have a destination. They move towards something specific. The activity surrounding the Sheen property looked targeted. Brian Entin of News Nation was among the national reporters who positioned himself to document that investigative activity directly. His presence at the property and the footage he captured of federal agents conducting operations at the connected residence became one of the most significant public moments in the entire case. Because Entin did not simply report that something was happening, he showed it. He placed himself physically at the location and documented what investigators were doing in real time. And what he documented, federal agents removing items from the home of the man who had been the last confirmed person with Nancy Guthrie before she disappeared, transformed public understanding of the case in a way that press conference language never could. The investigation had a direction. The investigation had a focus. And that focus had a name and an address. Again, none of that constitutes a legal finding of guilt. Investigative activity at a location does not equal a verdict, but it changes the emotional landscape of a case irreversibly. Because once the public witnesses federal agents carrying items out of a specific property, the presumption of randomness collapses. And once randomness collapses, every other detail in the timeline gets reinterpreted through the new frame. The last confirmed person with Nancy Guthrie, the repeated familiarity with the property, the knowledge of routines, the understanding of vulnerabilities, and now, federal agents conducting targeted evidence recovery inside the connected residence. The sequence was building towards something. Then another disturbing dimension of the case entered public awareness: signal jamming. According to investigators and analysts following the case publicly, there were growing questions about whether the person who approached the Catalina Foothills residence that night may have used specialized equipment designed to interfere with wireless communications at the property. That possibility changed the emotional structure of the case completely, because signal jamming devices are not the tools of impulsive criminals acting without preparation. They require deliberate research to identify and acquire. They require technical understanding of what they disrupt and how. They require advanced knowledge that wireless security systems exist at the specific target location, and they require a decision made before the crime to prevent those systems from functioning as protective infrastructure during the event itself. The use of a signal jammer, if confirmed, would represent a level of pre-crime planning that moves the investigation far beyond opportunistic violence. It suggests someone who studied the target's security architecture before approaching the property and took active steps to neutralize it. And that raises a question that investigators could not move past easily. What kind of offender would possess detailed enough knowledge of an elderly woman's home security to know that interfering with wireless communications would be operationally necessary? Someone who had never been inside the property, or someone who had visited repeatedly, observed the security infrastructure personally, and understood which systems would need to be addressed. The camera removal operated on a similar investigative logic. The masked individual captured on available footage reportedly physically removed the doorbell camera from the wall during the approach. That is not a panicked act. It is not improvisation under pressure. It is deliberate surveillance disruption. executed with enough composure to complete the action before entering the property. Deliberate disruption points toward planning, and planning was becoming one of the most consistent and unavoidable themes in the entire investigation. Then, the digital evidence took the case somewhere new entirely. According to reports that became part of the public record as the investigation progressed, investigators subpoenaed digital records connected to searches of Nancy Guthrie's home address, conducted months before her disappearance. Specifically, there were reports of Google image searches associated with her address during a period well in advance of the night she vanished. That detail became one of the most explosive developments in the entire public narrative of the case. Image searches, conducted on a specific residential address months before a crime occurs, carry a very specific investigative implication. People do not typically conduct repeated image searches of a private residential address as a matter of innocent curiosity. And when investigators subpoena those records and reportedly conclude that the searches may reflect operational preparation rather than innocuous information gathering, the timeline of the case extends backward in a way that is deeply significant. If someone was researching Nancy Guthrie's property months before she disappeared, then the crime did not begin on the night she vanished. It began during a period of quiet, concealed preparation, during dinner conversations, during family visits, during the ordinary interactions that no one examining them in the moment would have any reason to view as suspicious. The disappearance, if this interpretation proved accurate, was not the beginning of something. It was the conclusion of something, the final stage of a sequence that had been developing slowly, patiently, and deliberately over an extended period of time. That realization disturbed the public in a way that few individual case details managed to accomplish, because it suggested not just intent, but sustained and concealed intent. Long-term planning targeting someone who had every reason to trust the world surrounding her. The question that kept pressing forward through every layer of investigative analysis was a simple one. Why? And the answer that investigators appeared to keep returning toward through financial records, relationship analysis, and behavioral reconstruction consistently involved pressure, property, potential inheritance considerations, the intersection of financial strain and access to an elderly woman's assets. None of those elements independently establish a motive in a legal sense, and investigators never publicly declared a specific financial motive as confirmed fact during this period. But the cumulative pattern of what they were examining, the digital searches, the relationship dynamics, the conversations involving money, the operational sophistication of the disappearance itself, all of it pointed in the same direction. Prosecutors build major cases through cumulative gravity, not through single dramatic revelations, but through patterns, sequences, and the steady accumulation of individually explainable details that collectively become something far more difficult to explain away. This case appeared to be assembling exactly that kind of cumulative structure. The ransom notes added another disturbing dimension to an investigation already dense with troubling implications. Reports indicated that multiple notes were distributed, sent not only to family members directly connected to the case, but also to media organizations. The existence of ransom communication in a disappearance case is itself significant. But what reportedly drew the sharpest analytical attention was not simply the existence of the notes. It was their character. Behavioral analysts studying the communication patterns reportedly identified something deeply unsettling in the language of the notes. The pressure they applied was not generic. It was not the broad, threatening language of someone attempting to create fear in people they do not know. The notes reportedly targeted specific emotional pressure points within the family structure. The language appeared to reflect psychological awareness of how the family would respond to specific kinds of pressure, what would frighten them, what would destabilize them, what would produce the desired response. That level of psychological specificity does not emerge from studying strangers from a distance. It emerges from knowing people personally, from understanding how they think, from having observed how they respond to stress, conflict, and emotional pressure in real situations over real time. Behavioral experts reportedly concluded that whoever composed the ransom notes possessed an unusually intimate understanding of the family's internal emotional architecture. And that conclusion, placed beside everything else the investigation had already assembled, deepened the portrait of someone operating from within Nancy Guthrie's relational world rather than outside it. Strangers threaten broadly. People who know their targets threaten specifically. And the ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case reportedly threatened specifically. Behind the scenes, the investigation was also generating significant institutional tension that eventually found its way into public awareness. Questions emerged about the handling of the crime scene during the earliest critical hours following the discovery of Nancy's disappearance. Reports indicated that the blood-stained area near the entrance of the Catalina Foothills home was not secured with the speed and comprehensiveness that experienced forensic investigators would typically expect at a major crime scene. Questions about delayed evidence access and disputes surrounding forensic processing protocols between local Tucson law enforcement and federal investigators eventually became part of the public conversation around the case. Audiences following the investigation closely began interpreting the FBI's increasing involvement through a specific lens, not simply as the natural federal engagement that major kidnapping cases trigger, but as an effort to recover investigative ground that had been lost. During the first hours, when proper evidence preservation protocols appeared not to have been followed as rigorously as the situation demanded, whether that perception fully reflects the internal reality of the law enforcement collaboration on this case is impossible to determine from publicly available information. Investigations are complex. Institutional dynamics are rarely as straightforward as they appear from the outside, but emotionally, the perception mattered. It transformed the public's relationship to the investigation in ways that shaped how every subsequent development was interpreted. Audiences began emotionally aligning themselves with a particular version of the story. Federal investigators pursuing forensic truth, national reporters documenting what official sources would not directly state, former law enforcement analysts publicly discussing what the available evidence appeared to be telling anyone willing to read it carefully. The case became something larger than the disappearance of one woman. It became a public battle over institutional accountability and investigative truth. And that transformation intensified the national attention surrounding every new development in ways that kept the story at the center of public awareness for weeks. Behavioral analysts following the case began focusing their public commentary on something that experienced investigators understand to be among the most revealing dimensions of any major crime, not the event itself, the behavior surrounding it. Who changes their routines in the aftermath? Who becomes unusually composed when composure seems inconsistent with the emotional reality of the situation? Who focuses rapidly on practical concerns at a moment when grief and uncertainty might be expected to dominate? Who appears more concerned with managing the narrative surrounding the disappearance than with engaging openly with investigative uncertainty? Again, trauma affects people differently. Investigators know that grief does not have a single recognizable face. Some people shut down. Some people become hyperactive. Some people process catastrophe through action. None of those responses independently indicates guilt or innocence, and investigators are trained to apply that understanding carefully. But behavior still matters. And according to multiple analysts publicly discussing the case, post-disappearance behavior in the Nancy Guthrie investigation increasingly generated concern among those following it with professional attention. Reports circulated about activity at Nancy Guthrie's residence during the period following her disappearance. Vehicles connected to family members reportedly appeared at the property on multiple occasions, while the investigation remained fully active and Nancy remained legally a missing person, not a confirmed deceased individual. Innocent explanations exist for that kind of activity. Families deal with practical realities, even in the middle of traumatic events. Property requires attention. Valuables require securing. But timing changes the emotional weight of otherwise ordinary actions. And to many observers, the timing of certain activities surrounding the property felt inconsistent with the emotional reality of a situation where an elderly woman remained simply missing, somewhere unknown, with her fate completely unresolved. The emergency call connected to the case remained one of the most closely guarded details in the entire investigation. Despite the enormous public attention surrounding what had become a nationally followed story, the full recording of the relevant emergency communication reportedly remained withheld from public release. Former law enforcement investigators who engaged publicly with the case made a point that resonated deeply with audiences following the story. The withholding of that recording, they suggested, may itself be meaningful. Emergency recordings are protected from public release for numerous legitimate legal and investigative reasons, and no sinister interpretation should automatically attach to that protection. But once experienced former detectives began publicly noting that such recordings can become evidentiary material in prosecutorial proceedings, audiences interpreted every withheld detail through the lens of a future case being carefully protected. The public was no longer operating under the belief that investigators were simply trying to find answers. They were operating under the belief that investigators were protecting a prosecution that had not yet been formally initiated. That shift transformed everything. Every delayed release felt deliberate. Every carefully worded official statement felt strategic. Every new forensic update felt like another piece of a structure being quietly assembled behind closed doors. DNA analysis represented one of the darkest unresolved elements of the public record. Reports involving unidentified biological material at the scene created sustained speculation about who may have been present during the events surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Unidentified DNA does not establish guilt. It establishes possibility. But possibility, in a case already saturated with disturbing implications, functioned as powerful fuel for the investigation's forward momentum. What analysts publicly noted, and what deepened the public's concern considerably, was the emerging character of the offender profile that investigators appeared to be building. Not a career violent criminal with an established law enforcement record, not someone who fit the traditional pattern of a predatory stranger. Instead, the profile suggested someone socially integrated, someone who moved through ordinary life without obvious indicators of dangerous intent, someone trusted by the people around them. That possibility disturbed the public more profoundly than almost any other element of the case. Because stranger violence, however terrifying, is psychologically manageable in a way that intimate betrayal is not, we have frameworks for processing external threats. We have far less capacity for processing the idea that danger existed inside the world of someone who had every reason to feel safe. The most psychologically devastating dimension of the entire investigation was ultimately not any single piece of physical evidence. It was the pattern, again and again, across every analytical layer of the case. Investigators returned to the same convergence point. The operational success of the disappearance appeared to require informational advantage. Informational advantage of that specific and comprehensive nature almost always narrows the field of reasonable suspects dramatically. Whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home that night appeared to know the routines, the timing, the layout, the vulnerabilities, the window of uninterrupted access that the specific combination of circumstances would provide. The operational precision of the disappearance, the controlled movement, the surveillance disruption, the narrow window of execution, all of it consistently pointed toward someone who possessed knowledge that strangers simply do not possess about the private lives of elderly women living alone in residential neighborhoods. If the Google searches conducted months before the disappearance reflected genuine operational reconnaissance, then the danger surrounding Nancy Guthrie did not begin on the night she vanished. It had been growing during ordinary moments. During the family dinners she would have had no reason to view as anything other than normal. During the routine visits to her home that would have appeared to everyone involved as nothing more than ordinary family contact. The disappearance itself, if this interpretation proved accurate, was the final act of a sequence that had been developing in concealment for months. That possibility transformed the emotional meaning of the entire case. This was no longer a story about a tragic and sudden criminal event. It was a story about escalation, about a danger that moved slowly and invisibly through the fabric of ordinary life, before arriving at its conclusion during the early morning hours of one specific night. The FBI's behavioral analysis reportedly focused on exactly that psychological dimension. The offender, whatever their identity, appeared to investigators as someone calm under pressure, deliberate in movement and execution, methodical rather than emotionally explosive, patient enough to plan over an extended period, and controlled enough to carry out that plan without betraying the kind of visible instability that typically creates investigative leads in the immediate aftermath of a violent crime. Controlled offenders, investigators understand, maintain their composure longer than impulsive ones. But sustained investigative pressure eventually creates strain. Digital records accumulate. Communication patterns shift under scrutiny. Forensic evidence from Quantico takes time to process, but eventually yields results. Behavioral mistakes emerge under the psychological weight of an active federal investigation that has identified you as its focus. The walls, as anyone following the investigation closely understood, were tightening. The media attention surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case became relentless in a way that few missing person investigations generate. National correspondents remained embedded in the story for weeks. Analysts dissected every new development in real time on multiple platforms. Former detectives with decades of investigative experience became increasingly direct in their public commentary about what they believed federal investigators were constructing behind the closed doors of an ongoing federal case, a circumstantial prosecutorial structure built not from a single dramatic piece of physical evidence, but from motive, opportunity, behavior, timing, forensic reconstruction, digital records, and the cumulative weight of a sequence that, once examined in its totality, became extraordinarily difficult to explain through coincidence alone. Circumstantial does not mean weak. Some of the most consequential criminal prosecutions in modern legal history have been built almost entirely through circumstantial structures, where no single piece of evidence was individually decisive, but the accumulated pattern of evidence left rational alternative explanations with nowhere to stand. This case appeared to contain the core elements of exactly that kind of structure. What investigators still required was convergence, a moment where the accumulated suggestion of the evidence crossed into the territory of proof. Whether that moment would arrive, and when it would arrive, remained unresolved. But the public had already crossed its own threshold, not the legal threshold of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the emotional threshold of belief. People following this case no longer believed they were watching a mystery with an unknown ending. They believed they were watching a sequence move toward an inevitable conclusion. They believed that someone inside Nancy Guthrie's world had understood exactly how vulnerable she had become. And they believed that federal investigators understood exactly who that person was. Whether the evidence would ultimately prove strong enough to formalize that belief into a prosecutorial action was the only question left standing. Somewhere between the final goodbye at the end of an ordinary family dinner, the overnight silence that followed, and the silent and controlled movement captured on available surveillance footage during the hours before dawn, something happened inside this story that changed it permanently. And what Brian Entin documented standing outside the connected property, federal agents moving with purpose through a residence belonging to the man who was the last confirmed person with Nancy Guthrie before she vanished, represented a moment the investigation had been building toward for weeks. The case was no longer about searching broadly for an unknown offender. It was about building something specific around a specific person, a sequence of digital evidence, behavioral analysis, forensic reconstruction, financial dynamics, and operational familiarity that collectively told a story investigators appeared increasingly confident they understood. Nancy Guthrie deserves to have that story told completely. She deserves to have the truth surrounding her disappearance examined without flinching, without softening the implications, and without letting the complexity of the evidence become an excuse for looking away. Every investigation reaches a moment where the accumulated weight of evidence stops feeling like separate pieces and starts feeling like a single, undeniable direction. The Nancy Guthrie case reached that moment quietly, not through a dramatic public announcement, not through a press conference, but through the slow and methodical tightening of a sequence that investigators had been constructing for weeks behind closed doors. And the question that kept driving everything forward was the same one investigators had carried since the earliest hours of this case. Who understood Nancy Guthrie's life well enough to know exactly when she would be most vulnerable? Because that question was never really about a stranger. Strangers do not possess the kind of intimate operational knowledge this disappearance required. They do not know which cameras cover which angles. They do not know which hours produce the deepest silence inside a specific home. They do not know that an elderly woman removes her hearing aids before sleeping, or that no caregiver would be present overnight, or that the wireless security systems at a specific residential address could be disrupted in a way that would eliminate the most reliable layer of protection between a vulnerable woman and whoever was coming for her. That knowledge belongs to someone close, and the deeper this investigation moved, the harder it became to look anywhere other than the relationships surrounding Nancy Guthrie's daily life. The behavioral profile that federal analysts reportedly assembled only sharpened that conclusion. Someone intelligent and organized. Someone patient enough to plan across an extended timeline without betraying visible signs of intent. Someone emotionally controlled under pressure. Someone comfortable moving through the victim's environment, because that environment was already familiar territory. Profiles do not name individuals, but this one pointed consistently in a direction the public had already begun to recognize. What made the financial dimension of this case so psychologically heavy was not any single documented transaction. It was the pattern of pressure that investigators appeared to be tracing through the relationship dynamics surrounding Nancy Guthrie's life. Property value, potential inheritance considerations, the intersection of financial strain and proximity to an elderly woman's assets. None of those elements independently establish criminal motive in a legal sense, but cumulatively, placed beside the operational sophistication of the disappearance itself, they created a picture that was extraordinarily difficult to view as coincidence. The rear door staging theories added another layer that investigators could not dismiss. According to analysts publicly discussing the case, there were indications that portions of the property may have been manipulated before the actual abduction occurred. Prepared, not improvised, and prepared offenders almost always possess one of two things: repeated exposure to a location, or deliberate advance reconnaissance. This case appeared to reflect both. The DNA evidence that remained unresolved represented one of the darkest open threads in the entire investigation: unidentified biological material, the possibility of additional presence during the disappearance, Quantico processing timelines that stretched the public's patience, while federal analysts worked methodically through forensic material that could not be rushed without compromising its evidentiary value. The public felt that pressure building with every update. Every report involving federal forensic review intensified the expectation that something definitive was approaching. Somewhere between the final goodbye at an ordinary family dinner, the overnight silence that followed, and the controlled movement captured before dawn, something happened that changed Nancy Guthrie's life forever. And whatever federal agents removed from the connected property the day Brian Entin stood outside documenting their work may ultimately become one of the pieces that finally answers why. If this case matters to you, please hit the like button right now and subscribe to Keith's Crime Files so you are here the moment new developments in this story are covered. Nancy Guthrie deserves to have people paying attention, and this channel will keep following this case until the truth is fully told.